The resplendent calculation had been sitting in the Yanara corridor for 11 hours, and in those 11 hours nothing had happened. This was normal. Nothing ever happened in the Yanara corridor. It was neutral space, a long, thin stretch of dark that sat between the borders of 7 different civilizations, the way a hallway sits between rooms. Nobody owned it. Nobody wanted to own it because owning it meant being responsible for it. And the corridor was the kind of place where you wanted to be able to say, that's not mine if something went wrong in it. The resplendent calculations job was to walk that hallway, back and forth, 11 hours in one direction, turn around 11 hours back. Log everything, report anything unusual. Return home and do it again next week. In 42 patrols, Valoran had reported nothing unusual. He sat at his scan console and watched his instruments do precisely what they always did, which was record the presence of empty space and charge the Keth Dominion's military budget for the privilege. His forearms were folded across his chest in a position his crewmates called the bundle. It meant bored. He was too experienced to pace. He was too professional to complain. So he folded his arms and waited for 11 hours to become 12. His bioluminescent patches, strips of light-producing skin that ran along his neck and upper arms, glowed their steady pale blue, calm, alert, slightly dim at the edges, the way a lamp goes when the person holding it is thinking about something else. He was not thinking about anything else. There was nothing else to think about. Then his console made a sound, not an alarm. Alarms were for things that had already gone wrong. This was a soft, double-tone ping, the kind that meant something had drifted into sensor range, probably a hauler, almost certainly a hauler. The corridor saw a lot of hauler traffic lately, civilian freight ships, slow and fat in the middle, carrying ore and machine parts and food stocks between colonies. The Keth Intelligence Office had noted the increasing frequency of human-civilian traffic in the corridor 17 times in the last 4 years. It was becoming ordinary. Valoran unfolded one arm and pulled up the contact. Large. He adjusted the reading, checked for sensor error. The number held. He ran the profile through his database. Closest match, heavy freight transport, civilian class. But the proportions were wrong in a way that nagged at him like a word he almost remembered. A hauler was wide and short, a big belly, stubby frame. This thing was long, very long, and it wasn't in the hauler shape at all, now that the scan was building its outline. It was in the shape of something that had been designed to go through things, not around them. He ran the deep scan. The first layer came back in seconds. Hull material, iron alloy, titanium composite, and something else. Something mixed in that his scanner was cataloging incorrectly because it didn't have a clean entry for it. He ran the material analysis again. Same result. The compound wasn't exotic. It wasn't unknown. His equipment simply hadn't encountered it in enough quantity to have a proper reference file for it. He made a note. Human construction. Now, almost certainly, this was not unusual. Humans move through the corridor. Humans move through everywhere lately, with the slow, patient persistence of water finding cracks in stone. The Keth watched them the way you watch a river, not with alarm exactly, but with the awareness that rivers, given enough time, change landscapes. He kept scanning. The second layer took longer. This was the structural read, the one that measured the hull not just as material, but as architecture. How thick, how layered, how dense at each cross-section. Hull thickness was the first honest thing a ship told you about itself. A civilian hauler had thin walls because weight cost money, and money was the whole point of being a civilian hauler. A military ship had thick walls because the point was surviving things that wanted to end it. The reading came back. De Valoran looked at it. He recalibrated his instruments. Standard procedure. This took 40 seconds. He ran the layer again. The number was the same. He pulled up the hull classification chart, the one that ranked measured thickness against known vessel types. He had used this chart so many times that he knew where the tiers sat without looking. Civilian, bottom quarter, standard patrol military, low middle range, heavy combat designation, upper middle to high, and then at the top, in the narrow band where the numbers became uncomfortable, were the figures that appeared only in files with the Keth military's highest clearance markers. Figures for capital-class ships, carriers, dreadnoughts. The vessels that other vessels moved away from. The reading on this contact sat in the upper third of the chart, not the very top, but well above the range where you could call something a hauler and mean it. Vialoran's patches shifted without his choosing to shift them. Pale blue to a deeper, quieter shade, his body doing something his mind was still catching up to. He called across the bridge. "Pell, come look at this." Pell was the junior analyst. Young, eager, still at the stage of his career, where he thought patrols might be exciting. He came and looked. He looked at the hull reading. He looked at Vialoran. He looked at the reading again. "That can't be right," Pell said. "I've run it twice. Maybe the sensors are—" "Run the next layer." Pell ran the next layer. The third layer of a deep scan was the detailed structural imaging. The layer that went inside a hull the way a doctor's imaging equipment went inside a body. It showed compartments, systems, our equipment banks, anything large enough to generate a signature. It was the most expensive layer to run in terms of time and sensor power. Vialoran had run it maybe a dozen times in his career, and every time it had shown him the unremarkable insides of unremarkable ships. It showed him the weapon ports. They were folded into the hull's geometry so carefully that a visual scan would have shown nothing. Just the ship's outer skin. Dark, scarred, ordinary-looking metal. But the deep scan didn't care about appearances. It measured what was there, not what it looked like. And what it measured, hidden inside this ship's body like a fist inside a glove, was a weapons configuration that made Vialoran's 4 hands go flat and still on his console. He began to count the ports. He stopped at 30. There were more. He started again, marking each one on his display with a small red indicator, moving section by section through the ship's outline. Recessed launchers along the dorsal spine. Rail systems paired along the port and starboard flanks. Point defense clusters positioned to cover every approach angle. A ventral battery near the ship's midpoint that, based on the shape of its emitter geometry, could rotate and fire in a complete sphere around the vessel. Not just forward, not just to the sides, everywhere. When he finished counting, his display looked like the ship had been set on fire with red dots. He counted the dots. 47 distinct weapons ports. He checked his work. 47. Pell made a sound. Not a word. Something between a breath and a syllable. The noise a mind makes when it reaches for something to say and comes back with nothing. "It's a hauler," Pell said finally. His voice was very flat. "No. The size profile is a coat." Vialoran looked at the screen. "Look at what's under the coat." Pell looked. Pell didn't say anything else. The contact was still moving. Same speed, same heading. It hadn't powered any of its weapon systems. The reactor signature, he checked this now, running a 4th analysis specifically targeting the power plant, was running at what the instruments classified as low-output cruise mode, comfortable transit speed, the setting you used when you were going somewhere easy and nothing was wrong. It didn't know they were scanning it, or it didn't care. Vialoran sat with that for a moment and couldn't decide which version made him feel worse. He ran the registry ping. Every ship in known space was required to carry a registry beacon, a signal that answered the most basic question in space travel. Who are you and where are you from? The ping took 0.4 seconds to return. 2 words in electromagnetic signature. ISV Meridian's SCAR. He ran the name through his database. The file that came back was large. He opened it. He began to read. He read for 6 minutes. He stopped. Not because he'd finished. He hadn't finished. He stopped because there was a point in the middle of the file, past the commission date, past the class designation, into the operational record, where reading further felt like something he needed to make a decision about. Like stepping through a doorway he hadn't fully thought about stepping through. He closed the file. He sat with his hands flat on the console. His patches had gone dark. He didn't notice until Pell looked at him. Pell's own patches were flickering, the involuntary bioluminescent stutter that young Keth showed when they were frightened and hadn't yet learned to control it. Vialoran's were not flickering. They were simply off nearly. pulled inward like a creature that senses something very large nearby and goes very still. I need to contact the High Arbiter, Valorun said. He's in a policy session, Pell said. Yes, Pell understood. He went to the comm station. Valorun turned back to the contact. Still moving, still quiet, still wearing its civilian outline like a borrowed set of clothes, its real shape hidden underneath. He made himself open the registry file again. He read the section he'd stopped at. He read past it, into the parts he hadn't reached yet. And the operational record of the Meridian Scar was a long document. It listed every engagement the ship had officially participated in over the course of its service. Some of the names he recognized, battles that had appeared in Keth intelligence briefings over the years, conflicts that had been tagged, analyzed, and filed under headings like human military activity, observed and human expansion events, Western Corridor. He knew those names. He had read reports about those names, but those were not the entries that made him close the file the first time. It was the other entries, the ones that had no corresponding data in the Keth military database at all. Not classified, not redacted, simply absent. Engagements that the Keth intelligence services had never recorded, never heard of, never received any information about. More than 30 of them. Conflicts with no names he recognized, in regions he had partial knowledge of, against parties the file didn't specify. He ran the hull damage pattern analysis. The scan had already mapped every mark on the Meridian Scar's exterior. Every scar, every repaired section, every place where the ship had been hit and mended. His instruments could read the energy signatures left in damaged metal the way a trained reader read text. A thermal weapon left a different mark than a kinetic round. A plasma discharge left a different mark than a chemical explosive. The marks were still there, even under layers of repair, like words written under paint. He cross-referenced the damage signatures against known weapons databases. Most of the marks matched external sources. Weapons used by civilizations the Keth had cataloged. Those marks he could account for. They matched the named battles. The marks from the unnamed battles had a different signature. He ran the comparison twice, 3 times. Human weapons. The Meridian's Scar carried, pressed into its hole, the permanent marks of human weapons. It had been hit by its own kind. It had survived that. It had been repaired. And then someone had sent it back out. The comm station beeped. High Arbiter Soth was on the line. Valorun turned to the screen. Soth was a large Keth, senior enough that his bioluminescent markings had the deep, controlled glow of long experience. He was in a meeting room. Other officials were visible behind him. Impatient faces, the kind that belonged to people being interrupted during something they considered important. Analyst Valorun, Soth said, justify this. Human military contact in the corridor, Valorun said. Heavy class. Aggressive movement? None. Have they signaled us? They appear unaware of our presence. Then file a standard. I've completed the deep scan. Something happened in Soth's expression. A small tightening. Not much. Just enough for someone who knew his face well to notice. What class? He asked, differently than before. The ship's own registry listed as a general-purpose combat vessel, Valorun said. Mid-range designation. The officials behind Soth had stopped their own conversations. The room had become quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a sentence lands wrong. I would prefer to brief you in person, Valorun said. Soth studied his analyst through the screen. Valorun's patches were dark, very dark, a level of darkness that Soth had not seen from him in 9 years of working together. Not panic. Panic flickered. This was something else. The stillness of something that has already processed a shock and is now simply standing in the place it landed. I'll be there in 40 minutes, he paused. Is it the only one? The question was simple. It had a simple structure. It could be answered with one word. Valorun opened his mouth. He paused. 1.4 seconds passed between the question and the beginning of the answer. In those 1.4 seconds, Soth received more information than any word could carry. That is one of the things I would like to cover in the briefing, Valorun said. So Soth closed the comm line. Valorun turned back to his console. He looked at the meridian scar on his display, the long shape of it, the quiet reactor signature, the running lights off, the weapons tucked away, the whole vessel going about its business in the Inara corridor with the relaxed ease of something that had never needed to be anything other than relaxed. He made himself read the last section of the registry file, the part at the bottom, under the operational record and the damage history, and the long list of battles named and unnamed, the classification entry, the formal designation, ISV Meridians SCAR, Hull Class Meridian 7, Category General Purpose Combat Vessel, Operational Tier, Mid-Range, Status, Active. He read it once, twice, a third time, in case the words change. They didn't change. Mid-range. He sat with that word. He turned it over. He looked at the hull thickness reading, which put the ship in the upper third of the military classification chart. He looked at the 47 weapons ports. He looked at the damage record that covered 30 unnamed battles. He looked at the reactor output that his instruments had struggled to measure correctly because they hadn't been expecting those numbers from something this quiet. Mid-range. Not their best. Not their most powerful. Not the thing they sent when they were serious. The thing they sent when they were not yet serious. Outside the viewport, the Meridian's SCAR moved through the dark at its comfortable, unhurried pace. It didn't know it was being watched. Or it knew and had decided that being watched wasn't something it needed to change its behavior for. Valoran wasn't sure, even now, which of those was worse. He sat at his console with his patches still dark and waited for Soth to arrive. The Meridian SCAR kept moving. It didn't hurry. It had no reason to hurry. High Arbiter Soth arrived 38 minutes after Valoran's call. He came with 2 aides and no announcement, which was itself a statement. Soth was a man who announced himself in proportion to how seriously he wanted other people to take the situation. When he walked into a room quietly, it meant he had decided to take the situation seriously himself first, before deciding what he wanted others to do about it. He walked into the scan bay quietly. He looked at the display. The Meridian SCAR was still there, still moving, still quiet, still wearing its unremarkable exterior, like a costume it had borrowed for a very long trip. "Couldn't show me," Soth said. Valoran showed him. He started with the hull thickness. He explained the calibration process, how he had checked the reading twice, how the number had not changed either time, how it placed the ship in the upper third of the military classification range. Soth listened without expression. His aides took notes. He moved to the weapons ports. He pulled up the display with the red indicators scattered across the ship's outline. He explained the recessed geometry, how the ports were folded into the hull so precisely that visual inspection would miss them, how the deep scan had found them by measuring what the material displaced rather than what it showed. He counted through the categories: launchers, rail systems, point defense clusters, the ventral battery that could fire in a complete sphere. 47 ports total. As Soth looked at the number, he looked at the display. He did not say anything. "I want to show you something else," Valoran said. He pulled up the hull analysis, not the thickness reading, but the deeper study his team had been running for the past hour, while Valoran waited for Soth to arrive. The Keth had very good metallurgical analysis tools. They could read a ship's hull the way a skilled physician read a body, not just what it was made of, but what it had been through. The history of a metal surface was written in its structure. Every impact left a trace. Every repair left a seam. If you had the right tools and you knew what you were looking for, a hull could tell you everything that had ever happened to it. The Meridian SCAR's hull had a great deal to say. "The ship has been rebuilt," Valoran said. He partially and repeatedly. He pulled up the structural age mapping, a layer-by-layer analysis of when different sections of the hull had been fabricated. The color coding showed age ranges, from the oldest material in deep red to the newest in pale yellow. The display that appeared on the screen looked less like a ship and more like a geological map of something that had been buried and excavated and buried again several times. The keel was original, the oldest metal on the ship. Based on its composition and the crystalline structure that developed in certain alloys over time, it had been part of this vessel since the beginning, since the Meridian 7 class was first designed and the first hull was laid down. Everything else had been replaced at least once, some sections 4 times. One section near the forward starboard quarter, a structural rib that helped hold the bow geometry together, had been replaced 5 times. The current material was relatively new. The ghost impressions of the 4 previous versions were still readable in the metal around it. Soth's senior aide made a soft noise. Soth did not. "How old is the ship?" Soth asked. Valoran told him. Soth looked at the number. "That's older than some of our current patrol ship classes." "Yes, they kept it. They kept it, rebuilt it, rearmed it, and put it back in service. Multiple times." Valoran moved the display forward. "This is not unusual for human military vessels, based on the registry data I've pulled on comparable class ships. They don't retire hulls that have proven capable of surviving. They rebuild them," one of the aides said. "That seems economical." "It seems deliberate," Valoran said, and left the rest of that thought in the air. He moved to the next finding. This one had taken his team longer to understand, because it hadn't looked like what it was at first. The deep scan had mapped the lower decks of the Meridian Scar as a large climate-controlled space with heavy equipment signatures. The first red suggested weapon storage, ammunition banks, replacement systems, the kind of supply cache a long-range military vessel carried when it expected to be away from port for extended periods. It was not weapon storage, it was fabrication equipment. "They have a machine shop," Valoran said. "Not a small one. A production-scale fabrication system capable of manufacturing hull plating, components for the weapon systems, replacement parts for the reactor assembly, and, based on the material feed lines my team identified, ammunition for the rail systems." He let that sit for a moment. "The Meridian Scar can partially repair itself," he continued, "in open space, without a port, without support ships, without anyone's help." The room was quiet. "So it can stay out," Soth said, "indefinitely, as long as it has access to raw material feedstock, which the scan shows it carries." Valoran pulled up the cargo manifest reading. "Enough raw feedstock for approximately 2 full hull section replacements and a rearm of most of its primary weapons load." Soth looked at this for a long time. Then he looked at the display where the Meridian Scar moved through the corridor, slow and patient. Not going anywhere, it wasn't choosing to go. "Yeah, it isn't dependent on anyone," Soth said. "No. It leaves when it wants. It stays when it wants." "Yes. And while it stays, it can fix itself." "Yes." Soth clasped 2 of his hands behind his back. "Continue." The last finding was the reactor. Valoran had saved it for last, not for dramatic effect, but because it was the reading that had required the most verification. He had run the reactor analysis 4 times. He had pulled in his chief engineer to look at the numbers. He had cross-referenced the energy output profile against every reactor signature in the Keth database for known human vessel classes. Every time the number came back the same. "I want to walk you through this carefully," Valoran said, "because the first time I saw it, I assumed I had made an error." He pulled up the reactor output reading. A raw numbers first, the base energy measurement the scan had recorded. He then pulled up the conversion reference. "This is the standard military yield scale, the one we use to compare power output across different vessel types. I want to make sure that we're all reading from the same chart." He showed the chart. He pointed to the tiers: civilian, patrol, combat, heavy combat, capital class. He pointed to where the Meridian's Scar's reading landed on that chart. Soth's senior aide made the same soft noise as before. It was a different kind of soft noise this time. "That's running at cruise mode," Soth said. "Low output cruise." "Yes, approximately 30% of recorded maximum capacity for this reactor type." Soth stared at the chart. "At full output," he started. "At full output, how it would land here." Valoran moved his indicator up the chart, significantly up, into a range that, on the Keth's own classification system, was reserved for a specific category of vessel, a category that required special authorization to even discuss in open meetings, the category that held ships that could, on their own, end small wars. Soth did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "This is a mid-range vessel. That is its official human classification. Yes. By their own assessment, by their own system. Soth turned away from the display. He walked to the viewport and looked out at the corridor's dark. His hands, and all four of them, were clasped behind his back now, the posture he used when he was thinking hard enough that he needed to be still everywhere else. He stood there for 30 seconds. It felt longer. Ah, one of the aides said quietly to the other aide. If that's their mid-range designation, neither of them finished the sentence. Finishing the sentence would have made it real in a way that it was already real, but they weren't ready to hold yet. Valoran looked at his console. He had one more thing to show, but he had decided to let the reactor reading breathe for a moment before adding weight to it. He had been in enough briefings to know that sometimes the most useful thing an analyst could do was stop talking and let the data sit on the people in the room like the physical thing it was. He watched Soth think. Then Soth turned back. Is it alone? He asked. The scan shows one vessel. We have not detected any others in the corridor or in the adjacent sectors. Could there be others beyond sensor range? A pause. Yes, theoretically. What is the maximum effective range of our current sensor array? Valoran told him. It was a number he knew exactly, because maximum sensor range was one of the first things an analyst memorized about the ship they served on. You needed to know at all times exactly how far your knowledge extended and exactly where the dark began. Soth nodded slowly. He looked at the display one more time. The meridian scar, still moving, still quiet, still completely untroubled by the attention of a Keth patrol vessel it apparently didn't know was there. Is there anything else? Soth said. One more thing. Valoran pulled up the final analysis. I ran the registry file in depth, not just the basic entry, the full file, commission records, operational history, class documentation. He pointed to a specific line. Shuan, the Meridian 7 hull class has been in continuous active service for a very long time. It has been updated, re-engined, rearmed through multiple generations of technology, but the class itself has never been retired. This is not unusual for human military design. What is unusual is the documentation on why. He pulled up the relevant text from the registry file. He read it aloud in a level voice, because reading things aloud made people absorb them differently than reading them with their eyes. The Meridian 7 class remains in production and active deployment due to its demonstrated record of operational survivability under sustained hostile engagement conditions. The hull design, originally developed for high-intensity combat theaters, has consistently shown performance exceeding projected limits in field conditions. He stopped reading. Exceeding projected limits, Soth repeated. In field conditions, Valoran confirmed, which means the ship performed better in actual combat than the designers expected it to. Repeatedly, across multiple generations of the hull, enough times that they wrote it into the official retention justification. He let that land. They built a ship for war, he said. It was better at war than they expected. So they kept building it, and rebuilding it, and sending it out again. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Soth stood very still. His bioluminescent markings had not gone dark. He was too disciplined for that. But they had settled into the deep, flat glow of someone who was no longer in a meeting. Who was somewhere else in their head, working through something that had too many pieces to arrange quickly. Finally, one of the aides, the younger one, whose patches were giving him away badly, said, "What do we do?" Soth looked at Valoran. Valoran said nothing. This was not his decision. He had done his job. He had built the picture. What happened with the picture now was the work of other people. Soth made his decision the way he always made decisions, without announcement, without visible deliberation, as though the decision had simply been waiting for him to arrive at it. He turned to his senior aide. "Hail them," he said. The aide nodded and moved toward the comm station. "Politely," Soth added. The aide paused for just a fraction of a second, then nodded again. Valoran looked at the meridian scar on the display. He thought about the reactor running at 30%. He thought about the fabrication bay in the lower decks. He thought about the 5 replacement ribs in the forward starboard section, and the hull scars from battles that didn't exist in the Keth database, and the 47 weapons ports that you couldn't see unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. He thought about the word reliable, written in formal text in an official retention document, used to describe a ship that was better at war than its own makers had planned. Politely, he thought. Yes, that was exactly right. The Meridian Scar answered on the second hail. The comm screen opened and a woman appeared on it. She was somewhere in her middle years with a face that looked like it had been through enough to have learned how to be still. The dark hair cut close to the head, a uniform jacket worn open at the top, which was the kind of small informality that either meant low discipline or so much confidence in her authority that the jacket had given up trying to contain it. She was holding a cup. The cup was clearly coffee based on the dark color and the steam, and the way she was holding it with both hands like it was a thing she had earned. She looked at the screen. She didn't look surprised. "This is Commander Yeva Solano of the ISV Meridian's Scar," she said. "Identify yourselves." It was not aggressive. It was not soft. It was the voice of someone who had said the same words many times and saw no reason to dress them differently today. A very routine voice for a very not routine situation. Soth stepped into the screen's field of view. He had made the decision to handle the contact himself, which was either smart or a very significant mistake, and right now Vialarun was not sure which. The High Arbiter was practiced at first contacts. He had the right bearing, the right depth of voice, the kind of controlled bioluminescent glow that projected authority without aggression. He identified himself in the resplendent calculation in the standard diplomatic form. Title, vessel, governing body, intention of contact. "Commander Solano," he said, "we observed your vessel transiting the Yanara corridor and wish to conduct a standard inquiry. We have no hostile intention." A pause, short. "All right," Solano said. "Not, thank you for clarifying. Not, we welcome this opportunity for dialogue. Just, all right." As though this was a reasonable and ordinary thing that people said to her, and she had noted it and was now ready to move forward. "May I ask your purpose in the corridor?" Soth said. "Transit," Solano said. She didn't elaborate. She took a sip of her coffee. Vialarun watched from his station. He was patched into the comm feed on a secondary line, present in the conversation without being visible to the other party, which was standard intelligence procedure during first contact situations. His job right now was to listen carefully and flag anything that seemed significant. Everything seemed significant. He didn't flag anything. There was too much of it. The Keth had experience with first contacts. He had been part of 6 of them in his career. There was a pattern to them. The other party, regardless of species or diplomatic tradition, did the same basic thing. They presented themselves. They explained. They offered context about who they were and why they were where they were and what they wanted the other party to understand about their presence. This was not dishonesty. It was the universal language of beings who understood that strangers needed orientation. Solano had said one word, transit, and then she had waited. "Transit to what destination?" Soth asked. "That's a routing matter," she said. "Internal, not something I'd share in open space." Another pause. Soth absorbed this. "Of course, we respect operational security." "Good." Solano took another sip. Soth asked about the ship's operational status. A standard check. Was the vessel in need of assistance? Had there been any emergencies? Was the crew healthy and the ship functioning within expected parameters? These were the questions you asked to establish tone. And a ship in trouble wanted help. A ship not in trouble had no reason to be defensive. The question was a kind of handshake. "We're fine," Solano said. "No issues." "How long have you been in the corridor?" "About 6 hours. We'll be through in another 8 or so." Soth nodded. He was doing well. His voice was steady, his posture composed. He looked, to anyone watching, like a senior official conducting a routine discussion with a foreign military vessel that happened to have a reactor output in the capital-class range and 47 weapon ports folded into its hull, and he was treating this as a perfectly manageable situation. Vialarun admired the performance deeply and was aware it was a performance. Then Soth asked the crew question. It was standard profiling protocol. Every first contact included it. "How many personnel aboard?" "Read the number told you things. About the ship's automation level, its operational philosophy, how much the civilization in question trusted technology versus human presence. Whether the vessel was running lean for speed or heavy for redundancy. How many crew members do you have aboard? Soth asked. Solano looked at him for a moment, not with suspicion, with the look of someone doing a quick mental check. She gave a number. It was smaller than anything Velarun had calculated possible for a vessel this size. He ran the math again in his head. Even with heavy automation, even with the most advanced crew assistance systems that Keth could imagine, a ship with this weapons configuration required a certain minimum number of hands to operate effectively. The targeting alone required trained operators. The fabrication bay required engineers. And the reactor of this size required a dedicated maintenance team. The number she gave him was less than half of what the minimum should be. You operate this vessel with... Soth started. We manage, Solano said. It was not defensive. It was not proud. It was the voice of someone describing a simple fact of their daily life. We manage. The way you might say, we get by, or we make it work. An ordinary thing said about an extraordinary arrangement. Soth moved on. He asked about the ship's history in the corridor. Had they transited before? Were they familiar with the established transit protocols? Was there anything the resplendent calculation could provide in terms of navigational assistance? Diplomatic texture? Background noise? The kind of conversation that gave him time to think while sounding productive. Velarun was no longer listening to the diplomatic texture. He was listening to Solano. He was watching her face on the screen with the focused attention of someone whose entire professional skill was reading data for what it did not say directly. She was not performing ease. She was actually at ease. This was a distinction that mattered enormously and was very hard to explain to someone who hadn't spent years watching beings under pressure. Performing ease was a specific thing. The stillness was in the wrong muscles. The voice was calibrated slightly outside its natural register. The eyes tracked just a little too carefully. Performing ease looked like ease the way a good painting looked like a window. Close, but not the same as what it was pretending to be. Solano was not performing, she was just easy. She had looked at the Keith patrol ship's hail, answered it, identified herself, answered the standard questions, drunk her coffee. She was on the other side of this conversation the way she was probably on the other side of every conversation. Present, attentive, and not particularly troubled by it. Either she was the finest intelligence professional Velarun had ever observed, maintaining a perfect cover under a surprise contact, or contacting a foreign military patrol vessel in neutral space was, for her, in the category of things that did not require much adjustment. He wasn't sure which answer was more interesting. Then the question came that Velarun could not stop himself from asking. He had not planned to speak. He was an analyst on a passive feed. Speaking was not his role here. But the registry file was still open on his secondary screen, and the section with the unnamed battles was right there, and the hull damage patterns were right there, and the thought had been sitting in the back of his mind for 2 hours like something wedged under a door, and before he made a decision to ask it, he had already reached forward and opened his comm channel. "Commander Solano," he said. Soth looked sideways at nothing. He knew the voice. He didn't stop it. Solano looked slightly to the right on her own screen, tracking the new voice. "Who's that?" "My scan analyst," Soth said smoothly. "He has a technical question." "Sure," Solano said. Velarun looked at the display where the hull damage map was still visible. Suri, he looked at the sections his team had cataloged, the scars from weapons that had been identified as human origin. He looked at the battles that had no names in any Keth database. "Your vessel's hull shows extensive repair history," he said. "We've been able to match most of the damage signatures to documented engagements. But a significant portion of the damage record doesn't correspond to any contact in our database." A pause, short. "We're a working ship," Solano said. "We've been around." "The weapons signatures on the unmatched damage," Velarun said, "are consistent with human military ordnance." A different kind of pause, slightly longer. "Old fight," she said. "Against whom?" She looked directly at the screen. For the first time since the comm line opened, something shifted in her face. Not much. A small thing behind the eyes. Like a door that was closed and would stay closed, but that she'd let him see long enough to know the door was there. "Ourselves," she said. "Mostly." The word "mostly" sat in the comm channel between them. It sat there and did not move. Velarun did not speak again. He could feel Soth's attention from across the bridge without looking at him. The High Arbiter had also caught it, the mostly, the small word carrying its enormous weight. She had said it the way you described old weather, something that had happened, something she had moved past. She wasn't explaining the mostly. She wasn't going to explain it, mostly themselves, which meant, carried in the space after that word, that sometimes it had been something else, something outside, something she was less interested in discussing than the internal conflicts, in which she had mentioned first, as though those were the more ordinary category. Soth cleared his throat, gently, moving the conversation. "We appreciate your cooperation, Commander," he said. "The resplendent calculation has no further questions at this time. Safe transit." "Thanks," Solano said. "Same to you." The comm line closed. The bridge of the resplendent calculation was very quiet. Soth turned slowly. He looked at his senior aide. He looked at his junior aide. He looked at Vailorun. He took in the expressions of all three with the systematic patience of a man who was going to need to make decisions and wanted to know what material he was working with. Then he walked to Vailorun's console and looked at the display. The Meridian Scar was still on the same heading, still at cruise speed. There had been no weapons activation. No course adjustment, no change in any reading since before the comm line opened. The conversation had not altered the ship's behavior by a single measurable degree. "Increase our distance," Soth said quietly. 40,000 kilometers. Maintain the passive sensor array. His aide moved to issue the navigation order. "Keep it smooth," Soth added. "Don't make it look like we're doing it quickly." On the other side of the now-closed comm line, Commander Solano refilled her coffee. Vailorun was watching the passive feed, the Meridian Scar's sensor output, which was visible even from this distance to his equipment. He watched for any adjustment in the ship's own sensor activity, any indication that they had detected the resplendent calculations change in position. The Meridian Scar's sensors did not adjust, and the ship moved at the same speed on the same heading. It had not noticed the distance increase, or it had noticed and did not find it interesting. He was becoming familiar with the particular discomfort of not being able to decide which version was true. "She said mostly," the junior aide said. He said it quietly to no one in particular, in the voice of someone who had heard a word and couldn't stop turning it over. "Mostly themselves." No one responded. The word had already done what it was going to do. Explaining it wouldn't improve on it. Vailorun looked at the hull damage map still open on his secondary screen. He looked at the unmatched scars, the ones from the battles with no names, the ones from human weapons. He thought about the Meridian Scar being rebuilt 5 times and sent out again 5 times. He thought about the fabrication bay in the lower decks, the feedstock material, the self-sufficiency. He thought about the crew size, that number, that small, impossible number, and the way Solano had said we manage with the complete lack of emphasis that meant it was true and she didn't need him to believe it. He thought about the way she had answered every question, not evasively, not aggressively, just sparsely. The minimum word count required to give an answer, offered without decoration or effort. Not because she was hiding things, because talking more was not something this situation required of her. He thought about what that meant. A being under pressure talked more, explained more, offered more, because the gap between what they said and what might be suspected needed to be filled with words. A being who was not under pressure said what was necessary and stopped. Solano had said transit and we manage and mostly ourselves in old fights. She had said it the way you talked about the distance between cities or the weight of cargo. Information offered because it was asked for, no extra. She had not been trying to seem relaxed. She had simply been relaxed. Vailorun looked at the ship on his display. The thing carrying those weapons and those scars and that reactor and those nameless battles and that small, impossible crew. He thought, she knows exactly what her ship is. She knows what it means in anyone else's frame of reference to be sitting across a comm line from a vessel that carries these numbers. And she drank her coffee. He looked at the hull damage map one more time, at the scars from the battles with no names, at the damage from human weapons, her own kind's weapons, pressed permanently into the metal of a ship that had survived them. He thought about what you had to be, as a people, for that to be the unremarkable version of history. For that to be the category of fight that your commander mentioned first, in a routine first contact, with the tone of someone describing weather. He closed the hull map. He didn't need to look at it anymore. He had already looked at it enough. "Hi, Arbiter," he said. Soth looked at him. "I need to run a more detailed analysis tonight," Valoran said. "If you can give me access to the full intelligence archive, not just the military files, the broader database, commercial records, civilian reports, historical data." Soth studied him. "What are you looking for?" Valoran looked at the display where the Meridian scar was still moving, still quiet, still going wherever it was going at a pace that suggested nowhere urgent. "I want to understand what kind of people send this ship to neutral space," he said, "and call it routine." Soth held his gaze for a moment. Then he gave the access authorization. Valoran did not sleep. This was not unusual. He was the kind of person who, when he had a problem, needed the problem to be finished before his body would agree to rest. It was a useful trait in an analyst and a terrible trait in everything else about his life, and he had long since made peace with the trade. He sat in the data room, a small space off the main scan bay. He filled with screens and a chair that had been adjusted for his body type over so many years that it fit him the way a much-used tool fits a hand. He pulled up everything he had access to. He started building. The Keth Intelligence Archive was comprehensive. Not complete, no intelligence archive ever was, but comprehensive in the way of an institution that had been watching its neighbors for a very long time and understood the value of paying attention to small things before they became large ones. There were files on human civilization going back to the early period of Keth-human contact, trade records, diplomatic communications, civilian shipping logs, military incident reports, population surveys, economic data, political structures, where the Keth had been able to map them. He started with time. He built a timeline. Not of human space history. The Keth's knowledge of that was good but limited by how long humans had been spacefaring. He built a timeline of human history as far back as the archive reached, which was far, very far. The Keth had done their research. He started marking events. He used 3 colors, one for periods of documented large-scale armed conflict, one for periods of documented smaller-scale armed conflict, one for periods where the records showed no evidence of significant organized violence at all. He worked through the timeline. He marked events. He moved forward through history. He was 3/4 of the way through when he stopped and looked at what he had built. The first color, large-scale conflict, ran in long, dense stretches across the timeline. These were not rare. They were not exceptional. They were the rule. In wars that lasted decades, conflicts that consumed whole regions of the species' home planet and then the space around it, the colors overlapped. Before one large conflict had fully ended, another was beginning somewhere else. Sometimes they were happening at the same time in different places. Sometimes they were the same war wearing different names in different parts of the world. The second color in smaller scale conflict was present everywhere, everywhere. There was not a single section of the timeline, even the sections between the large wars, that was free of it. Small conflicts, border skirmishes, internal suppressions, rebellions, insurgencies. They were the wallpaper behind the larger events, the constant, unremarkable background noise of human history. With the third color, the no conflict color, appeared 3 times on the timeline. Short stretches, brief. Spaces between events that you might, if you were being generous, describe as approximate peace. He looked at these sections carefully. Then he read the corresponding records for those periods. The records described them not as peace, but as preparation, political realignment, military reorganization, resource accumulation, the resting state between efforts. He removed the third color from his timeline. He looked at what remained, continuous. From the first record of organized human violence to the present day, across every period the archive covered, the colors ran unbroken. The conflicts changed shape, the technologies changed, the political structures changed, the names of the parties fighting changed, but the fighting did not change. It continued, in different places, under different names, for different stated reasons, but it continued. Valoran sat back in his chair. He was aware that he was a data analyst and not a philosopher, and that what he was about to think was closer to philosophy than data analysis. And he made this concession to himself and then thought it anyway. Every civilization that Keth had encountered, every one of them, had a history of conflict. Violence was not unique to humans. Resources were finite. Territory was contested. History was not gentle to any species that had made it to the stars. But every other civilization had a before and after, a period where conflict was a dominant feature of their existence. And then, through development, through catastrophe, through the kinds of changes that reshaped whole societies, a shift, a change in how they organized themselves, a point after which conflict became less frequent, less total, less permanent. Every civilization had that moment. He looked at the human timeline. He looked at it for a long time. He looked for the moment. He couldn't find it. He ran a secondary analysis to make sure he hadn't missed it. A conflict frequency chart tracking the density of documented armed incidents per time period across the whole timeline. If there was a moment where humans had turned a corner, the density would drop. It would show in the numbers. The chart came out nearly flat. There were spikes, periods of unusually high activity, and there were slight dips. But the overall level did not drop significantly at any point. The frequency was too consistent, too stable. The slight variations looked like noise around a very steady signal. The signal said, "This is what humans do." He sat with that for a while. Then he ran the second analysis. The second analysis was military development. He pulled the human weapons development record, not just the weapons themselves, but the rate of development. How fast did human military technology advance? How quickly did they move from one generation of a system to the next? What was the gap between a design being conceived and a design being fielded? The numbers were uncomfortable. Every other spacefaring civilization that Keth had data on showed a similar pattern in their military development. Fast early progress driven by obvious necessity, slowing as the technology matured and the most pressing external pressures were addressed. This was logical. One, you developed fast when you needed things. You developed slower when the urgency eased. The rate of development was tied to the pressure. Human military development had never slowed. The rate at which humans designed, tested, fielded, revised, and improved military systems was consistent across every period of their history that the archive covered. The technology changed from primitive to advanced to extraordinary. But the pace at which they developed it did not change with the technology. If anything, it had increased. Each generation of tools made the next generation easier to build. And they used that ease to build faster, not to build less. He thought about why this might be. He thought about it for some time. The most obvious answer was that the pressure had never eased. If the conflict frequency was constant, and the need was constant, the urgency that drove development in other civilizations' early histories had in humans simply never stopped. They had never reached the point where they could afford to slow down, because the thing that made slowing down possible, a period of genuine stability, had never fully arrived. He built a third chart. Military technology age versus operational service. How long did human military equipment stay in use? He pulled data on ship classes, weapon systems, vehicle designs, defensive installations. He tracked their first operational date and compared it to the present record. Was the system still in use? If retired, when? How long had it served? The results were clear. Human military hardware lasted a very long time. Systems that had been designed decades ago were still in active service. It upgraded and improved, but not replaced, because the upgrades worked and replacement was expensive, and the things they had already built had already proven they could do what was needed. The Keth retired systems on a scheduled basis, regardless of performance. Humans retired systems when the system stopped working. Some of them had not stopped working. He thought about the Meridian's scar, about the original keel, about the 5 replacement ribs, about the fabrication bay, about the 47 weapon ports in a hull that had been rebuilt so many times that its metal was a geological record of everything it had survived. He pulled the full-class documentation for the Meridian 7 hull. He found the retention document. the official justification for why the class remained in production and active service after all this time. When he found the section he had read to Soth earlier, he kept reading past the part he'd read aloud. The document went further. It detailed the class's performance history across its service life. It listed the specific engagements where the design had exceeded projected limits. The phrase from the earlier section. It explained what that meant in practice. It meant that ships of this class, in actual combat conditions, had consistently performed better than the engineers who designed them had calculated they would. This had happened in the first operational year. The engineers had revised their projections upward. The updated projections had also been exceeded. The engineers had revised again. The revised projections had been exceeded again. At some point in the document, the engineers had stopped revising their projections and instead added a note to the class documentation. The note said, "Field performance of Meridian 7 class vessels consistently indicates that theoretical performance models underestimate operational capacity under sustained engagement conditions. Recommend basing planning assumptions on demonstrated field results rather than modeling." He read this note twice. The engineers had given up trying to predict how well their ship would do in a fight. They had decided that the fight would tell them more than the math would, and they had used the fight's testimony as their new baseline. There was a word in the document. Near the end of the retention section, one word used to justify the continued production of a vessel class that was old enough to have a geological record of repairs, one fast enough to still be relevant, and strong enough to have beaten its own designer's math every time they tried to calculate its limits. The word was reliable. He stopped reading. Reliable. He looked at that word for a long time. Reliable was a word you used about things that had never let you down, a tool you trusted, an instrument that always gave you the right reading, a process that produced the same result every time you needed it to. Reliable was not a word for exceptional things. It was a word for things you had come to depend on so consistently that their dependability was their primary characteristic. Not amazing, not extraordinary, reliable. They had built a ship that outperformed its own specifications in actual combat every time they put it in actual combat. They had done this so consistently, or across so many versions and rebuilds of the design, that the quality they had chosen to name, the quality that appeared in the official retention justification, the quality that had kept this ship in production for longer than some civilizations had been spacefaring, was not powerful or effective or formidable. It was reliable, like a tool you kept because it worked. Vial Arun closed the document. He sat in the data room for a while without opening anything else. He thought about the human timeline, the continuous colors running from the earliest records to now, the military development that had never slowed, the equipment that stayed in service until it stopped working, and a great deal of it had never stopped working, the engineers who'd learned to trust the fight's results over their own math. He thought about Commander Solano on the comm screen, drinking her coffee, saying, "We manage about a crew size that should have been impossible for a ship this size." He thought about her saying old fights, and mostly ourselves, with the flat simplicity of someone recounting things that had happened in the past and were now finished and not worth elaborating on. He thought about what you had to become as a species to arrive at that posture. Not hard, not violent, just settled. In a way that went very deep, in a way that came from having been in the thing so long that the thing had become ordinary. Not a state of exception, just the state, the background, the normal against which other things were measured. And the Meridian Scar was their normal, a mid-range vessel, not exceptional, not their best, and the thing they sent when they were not yet concerned enough to send anything better. He thought about that word again. Reliable. He opened a new document. He had a report to write. He had been composing it in his head for the last several hours, between the analyses, between the charts, between the moments of sitting still while the data settled into something that had a shape. He wrote the report. It took him 11 minutes. When he was done, it was 2 lines long. He read them back to himself. They were the right 2 lines. He saved the document and flagged it for immediate delivery to the High Arbiter's personal secure channel. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the data room for a while. The resplendent calculation was still moving through the corridor. In maintaining its extended distance from the Meridian Scar, Both ships were still on their headings. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about the third color on his timeline, the one he had removed, the not quite peace periods, the preparation periods, the resting places between efforts. He thought, every other civilization we know has learned to stop. He thought, humans have learned to rest. There was a difference. He was not sure anyone outside this room understood yet how large the difference was. He closed his eyes. He was very tired. He was also aware that his body still would not agree to sleep, because the problem was not finished. He had written the report. The report was done. But the problem was the thing underneath the report. The thing the report pointed at without fully saying, Tunana, the thing that, if Soth read the two lines and understood them the way they were meant to be understood, would require a different kind of response than the Keth Coalition had ever had to formulate before. Not a military response. Not a diplomatic one either, exactly. Something harder than both of those. An honest assessment of what they were dealing with. Not the ship, not even the species as a category, but the specific, particular, deeply embedded reality of what it meant to be the kind of people who built the Meridian Scar, called it mid-range, and sent it through a neutral corridor on a transit run without a second thought. He opened the comm line to Soth's quarters. It was very early. The High Arbiter answered quickly, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "Did you read my report?" Vale Arun asked. "Yes," Soth said, in a pause. "Are you certain?" Soth said. "I've been building the picture for 6 hours," Vale Arun said. "I've checked the sources. I've checked the methodology. I've built the charts 3 different ways to see if the shape changes." "Does it?" "No." Another pause, longer. "Then we need to call the council," Soth said. "Yes. They won't want to hear this." Vale Arun thought about the timeline, about the flat frequency line, about the word reliable in the retention document, about Solano and her coffee and her very ordinary face and her very unordinary ship. "Nobody wants to hear this," he said. "That doesn't change what it is." Soth was quiet for a moment. Then, "Get some rest. We have a very difficult day ahead." Vale Arun looked at the ceiling of the data room. He thought, "I am not going to sleep." "Yes, High Arbiter," he said. He closed the comm line. He sat in the chair and looked at his 2-line report on the screen. "The Meridian Scar is what they send when they are not yet concerned. I recommend we ensure they never become concerned." He sat with it a while longer. Then he turned off the main screen and sat in the dark and tried to decide, for the first time in a very long career, whether he was afraid. He decided that afraid was not quite the right word. What he was, more precisely, was awake. Very awake. In the way you become awake when you realize that the world is somewhat larger and somewhat different than you had been calculating, and that your calculations will now need to start over from a place much further back. He stayed awake until morning. It didn't seem like the right time to stop. The Keth Coalition Council met an emergency session at midday. There were 23 members. They came in from their various offices and residences and conference rooms, still wearing the bioluminescent patterns of interrupted meetings and disrupted mornings. And they filled the chamber seats with the focused, mildly irritated energy of people who had been told that something important had happened and were reserving judgment on whether they agreed. Soth stood at the center of the chamber. He had the scan data projected on the wall behind him. The hull readings, the weapons layout, the reactor output, the registry file. He had the metallurgical history with its geological layers of repair. He had Vale Arun's charts, the timeline, the development rate, the equipment service life data. He presented everything. He was good at this. He had done it many times. He laid the information out in a clean order, with space between each finding for the council to absorb it, and he kept his voice level and his bioluminescent patterns steady, because a speaker who showed agitation transferred that agitation to the room, and a room full of agitated political officials was not a useful working tool. When he finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then everyone spoke at once. It took 12 minutes for the arguments to separate into something resembling distinct positions. Vale Arun sat in the analyst's gallery, one level above the chamber floor, behind a rail, where the technical advisors observed and waited to be called on. He watched the council fracture the way he had known it would fracture. The same 3 directions. They always went the same 3 directions. It didn't matter what the situation was. The Hawks went first because they always went first. Aggressive people moved into space early before others were ready to occupy it. Counselor Mouth, older, dense with the kind of conviction that comes from having been right twice in his career and never forgetting it, stood and made his case. One human warship had been identified. Its position was known. Its capabilities had been measured. The situation was clear. A decisive response now, while the element of surprise existed, was not an act of aggression. It was logic. It was the basic mathematics of security. Neutralize what you can neutralize before it becomes what it is capable of becoming. He said the word decisive 6 times in 4 minutes. This was the word people used when they meant violent and wanted to sound like they meant something else. The doves assembled themselves more carefully, the way people who wanted to stop something urgent always had to be careful, because the room's energy moved toward the urgent option first, and you had to work against the current. Counselor Venn, measured, long experienced in formal diplomacy, the kind of official who understood that most situations were solved by the right sequence of words in the right order, offered the counter position, formal diplomatic channels, an official approach to the human government, an expression of willingness to discuss the Meridian's SCAR's transit as an opening rather than a provocation. Establish contact on equal terms before any decision was made about what kind of contact was warranted. While she said the word framework often, frameworks were what diplomats built when they needed something to stand on while they thought of what to say next. The two sides argued. The chamber filled with it, the back and forth of an argument that both sides had already decided to have before they heard the data, because both sides had arrived at their positions the way people arrived at most positions, through who they were, not through what the situation required. Valorum sat in the gallery and waited. He had thought about asking to speak. He had decided against it. He was an analyst. His job was to build the picture. The picture was built. He had provided it. What the council did with the picture was the work of other people. And he had long since learned that analysts who tried to do politicians' work for them usually ended up doing neither job well. But there was one piece of data he hadn't presented to Soth. He had found it 2 hours ago, buried in a secondary analysis he'd been running in the background while he built his other charts. He had flagged it for himself. He had been waiting for the right moment to bring it forward, because the right moment for a thing like this mattered almost as much as the thing itself. He watched the chamber. He waited for the argument to reach the point where both sides had finished saying the things they were committed to saying and were now repeating themselves in different arrangements of the same words, because that was the point where a room became ready to hear something new. It took 40 minutes. Then he asked to speak. Soth gave him the floor. Valorum came down from the gallery. He stood at the center of the chamber. 23 council members looked at him with the expressions of people who had been arguing and were being interrupted and were trying to decide how much to resent it. He didn't use many words on the setup. There wasn't time, and there wasn't need. During the contact with the Meridian SCAR, he said, I ran a secondary analysis of all communication signals in the surrounding space. This is standard protocol for first contacts. We log all transmission activity in the local area to build a full environmental picture. He pulled up the data on the chamber's display. The Meridian SCAR was transmitting throughout the contact, he said. This is not unusual. Ships transmit constantly. Or routine operational signals, navigation checks, internal communication. We log it and filter it, and generally do not prioritize it unless the content is significant. He let a pause sit there. Short. The content was significant. He pulled up the transmission analysis. Frequency, duration, signal structure, directional data. The Meridian SCAR was sending an outbound signal on an automated broadcast protocol, a standard operational update. This is a regular function of human military vessels. They send routine status updates at set intervals to maintain awareness across a theater. The content of the signal was standard. Current position, current heading, contact information, relevant environmental data. He pulled up the directional map. The signal's destinations, plotted in 3 dimensions around the corridor's position. The signal was addressed to 41 recipients, he said. The chamber went quiet. Not the quiet of a pause in argument. A different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when a room understands something before the person speaking finishes explaining it. He kept his voice level. He had practiced this. 41 vessels received this signal. Based on the transmission strength and the signal return signatures I was able to capture, those vessels were located in the sectors immediately adjacent to the Yanara corridor. They were not in the corridor itself. They were outside our sensor range at the distance we were maintaining. He let that sit. The signal was not encrypted. It was not hidden. It was a standard automated operational broadcast, or which any equipment capable of reading human military frequencies could receive and decode. He looked at the council. They were not hiding, he said. 41 vessels, positioned outside our sensor range in the sectors surrounding the corridor, and they were broadcasting their presence on an open protocol to anyone with the right equipment. They weren't trying to conceal themselves. They simply weren't within the range we were scanning. The chamber was very still. During the entire contact period, Valoran said, we were in the center of 42 human military vessels. We identified one. The other 41 were present, receiving updates on our conversation and doing nothing. He waited a moment. They were waiting, he said, to see if the Meridian Scar needed them. He pulled up the signal log. Yes, the timestamps were there. Every update the Meridian's Scar had sent, and the window in which each had been received by the other vessels. The first signal had gone out before Soth's hail. The signals had continued throughout the conversation. The last one had gone out 6 minutes after the comm line closed, with updated position data and, he had decoded this section carefully, a status flag. The status flag read, contact nominal, proceeding, no alert, no response request. Just, this was normal, continuing as planned. Counselor Mouth had gone very still. The density of his earlier conviction had not gone away, but it had rearranged itself into something that looked less certain of its own edges. Counselor Venn had her hands folded on the table in front of her. She was looking at the display with the expression of someone who understood, suddenly, that the framework she had been building was going to need a much larger foundation than she had started designing for. The Meridian Scar, Valoran said, was not sent alone because it was considered sufficient on its own. It was sent alone because this is how they move. The other 41 vessels were not there to support the Meridian Scar. The Meridian Scar was not in need of support. He looked around the room. The 41 were there, he said simply, because this is how they travel. He stepped back. He had said everything he had to say. He had built the picture as completely as he knew how to build it. Soth took the floor again. The council session continued for another 3 hours. Neither three factions did not disappear. Factions rarely disappeared. They reorganized themselves around new information and found new arrangements for their existing convictions. But the weight of the conversation shifted. The room had felt, when it walked in, like a room in which action was possible, and the only question was which action. It felt different now, heavier, more careful, like a room that understood it was making calculations about something it did not yet fully know the dimensions of. Valoran went back to the gallery. He sat and watched and thought about the status flag. Contact nominal, proceeding. He thought about Commander Solano refilling her coffee, sending a routine update to 41 ships, flagging it nominal, proceeding. He thought about what nominal meant. Normal, within expected parameters, standard. The thing happened the way the thing was expected to happen, and there was nothing to report that was outside the range of what had been anticipated. This was nominal. This was the baseline. This was the category of event that did not require additional action or elevated response. A foreign military patrol vessel in neutral space conducting a scan and a contact was, in Commander Solano's operating framework, nominal. He sat with that for a while. The council reached conclusions. Not unanimous. The council rarely reached anything unanimous because 23 people with strong opinions and long careers did not often agree completely about anything. But they reached a working position. Diplomatic contact would be initiated through formal channels. The intelligence services would be tasked with a comprehensive analysis of human military disposition in the corridor region. No offensive action would be taken, no aggressive positioning, and the distance between the resplendent calculation and the Meridian Scar would remain at 40,000 kilometers until the human vessel cleared the corridor, and the question of what to do next could be taken up in a calmer environment. The chamber emptied in stages. The council members left in small groups, talking quietly among themselves. The bioluminescent patterns of their conversation muted and careful. The room that filled up loud came out quiet. Soth remained until the chamber was nearly empty. He stood at the display wall looking at the signal map. The 41 destinations plotted in 3 dimensions around the corridor's position. His hands were clasped behind his back. His patterns were deep and steady. Valoran came down from the gallery. He stood beside Soth and looked at the same display. The two of them were quiet for a moment. "She knew we were there," Soth said. He didn't say it as a question. "I believe so," Valoran said. "The signal timing. The first broadcast went out before your hail. She was already reporting the contact before we'd identified ourselves. She could tell we were running a scan. Any vessel with standard passive detection capability would have registered our scan signal." "Yes. So she knew." Soth looked at the map. "She knew we were there, scanning her, and she sent a routine update to 41 ships and flagged it as normal." "Yes. Not because she wasn't paying attention." "No," Valoran said. "Anna, I don't think she ever stops paying attention. I think she decided we didn't require a response beyond what she gave us." Soth was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the display. The map showed the corridor and the resplendent calculations position and the position of the Meridian's scar during the contact window, and the 41 signal destinations spread through the surrounding space like points in a constellation. A constellation that had been there the whole time, watching, not hiding, just waiting to find out if waiting was going to be enough or if something else was going to be needed. Nothing else had been needed. The status flag had said so. "They sent her alone because she was enough," Soth said. He said it quietly. Not to Valoran, not to anyone in the room, to the display maybe, to the information in it. He paused. "One, and she knew it," he said. Valoran looked at the map. He thought about the Meridian's scar still moving through the corridor somewhere, past the contact window now, continuing toward wherever it had been going when they first scanned it. Nominal, proceeding. He thought about the 41 ships, adjusting their positions slightly as the Meridian's scar moved, maintaining their formation in the dark outside the sensor range of a Keth patrol vessel that had thought it was conducting a standard contact with a single ship. He thought about what it meant to be a people for whom this was routine, not exceptional, not special, not a deployment that required planning and authorization and careful discussion about what the 41 ships were for and whether this was the right number. Just the way they traveled. He thought about Commander Solano's coffee, the way she'd held it with both hands, the ease of her voice, the minimal word count of her answers. He thought she wasn't unconcerned because she was careless. She was unconcerned because she was prepared, completely, habitually, in the deep, quiet way of something that has been prepared for so long that preparation has become the resting state, and the absence of threat is just a different kind of ready. He thought about the hull damage from human weapons, the unnamed battles, the rebuilt ribs, the word reliable in the official document. He thought about all of it. He thought about a species that had never fully stopped fighting and what you became if you had enough time to learn every edge of that experience, every shape of that work, and until the work was no longer something you had to think about, until it sat in you the way balance sits in a body, not a thing you managed, a thing you were. "What do we do?" he said, not because he expected Soth to have the answer, just because the question needed to be in the air. Soth looked at the map for a long time. "We learn to be useful to them," he said, "before they have a reason to notice us more carefully." He turned off the display. He walked toward the chamber door. He paused in the doorway for a moment, not turning back, just standing. "Send a commendation to your team," he said. "They did good work today." "They did," Valoran said. "So did you." Then Soth left. Valoran stood in the empty chamber for a while. The display was dark. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the Yanara corridor, a warship called the Meridian's Scar was continuing its transit on its original heading at its original speed, with its reactor at 30% and its weapons folded away and its crew of an impossible number doing whatever they did on a routine day. Somewhere around it, at comfortable distances, 41 other ships were doing the same. Contact nominal. Proceeding. He walked to the window at the side of the chamber. The view from this level showed the city, Keth architecture, curved and luminescent, built for beauty as much as function, because the Keth had always believed that the things you built around you shaped the kind of thinking you were capable of. He looked at it. He thought, we built this in peace. Not because we were always peaceful. The Keth had their own history, but because at some point the wars had ended. The conflicts had stepped back. The pressure had eased enough that something like stability was possible. And in the stability, cities. He thought about the human timeline, the continuous colors. He thought, they built what they built in something else entirely. He thought, and it made them into something else entirely. He wasn't sure whether that was a terrible thing or an extraordinary one. He suspected it was both in equal parts, and that the difficulty was the equal parts. That you could not separate the terrible from the extraordinary, because they were the same thing looked at from different directions. He stood at the window for a while, then he went back to work. There was a full intelligence analysis to write, a recommendation for the diplomatic approach, a briefing for the security subcommittee, a complete report on the 41 vessels, their positions, their estimated classes, what could be inferred about human military deployment patterns in the corridor region from the fact that 42 ships had been in those sectors simultaneously. There was a great deal of work. He was glad to have it. Work was the good kind of problem. Work was a problem that moved toward its own solution if you put enough hours in. He went back to the data room. He sat in his chair. He opened his screen. He started building the picture. Outside, the Meridian scar cleared the far end of the Yanara corridor sometime before evening. The resplendent calculations sensors tracked it to the edge of their range and then lost it in the dark. Gone. Just like that. As if it had never been there at all. Valoran noted the departure time in his log. When he noted the heading, he noted the final reactor reading. Still at 30%, still at cruise speed, still unhurried, still easy, still going wherever it was going, with the full and complete confidence of something that had never had a serious reason to be anything else. He closed the tracking window. He went back to work. He did not think about the 41 ships that had also gone, spreading out from the corridor in different directions, back to whatever they had been doing before the Meridian's scar needed them to be nearby. He did not think about it because thinking about it did not help him do his job. He thought about it anyway.